Okay, now, it is such a pleasure for me, for the first time, to introduce a wondrous new author on the planet who speaks on behalf of the Earth, and the author of a terrific new book, Reunion, Ellen Gunter. On Earth, this is in honor of her book and because it is Earth Week, Earth Day, and we need to celebrate people who work so hard for our survival and for the survival of our planet. So, ladies and gentlemen, one of our troopers.
Thank you all for welcoming me so effusively. This has been something of an incredible journey for me, for my family, and my co-author, Ted Carter. I think some of you know who he is, and an absolutely incredible Earth mystic. For my wonderful friend, Carolyn, for my darling husband, my friends, my soul companions who have supported me through this relentlessly and endlessly. This all started as something that was supposed to take 3 months. Ted and I got together on my 60th birthday, actually, the time when I still thought I was about to relax into a quasi-quiet retirement, but as we know, that the universe often has other plans for us than what we think is coming down the pike. So he and I decided to do a little book on how he does landscaping. And so I spent a week up there talking to him and kind of going out and seeing what he does. And as we began to get energized about this, we said, you know, there's a whole lot of other stuff going on with the Earth right now. I mean, let's, you know, just, we're delineating these over and over and over. And I said, you know, maybe it's not a little book on landscaping. Let's just think about this some more. So I went home. And about 2 nights later, I woke up in the middle of the night, and I was just shaking. And I didn't know what it was. It wasn't a bad thing. It was really fine. But I got up and fired up my laptop and closed my eyes. And what dumped out into my screen was what this book became. It was a 17-page proposal. So I looked at that, and for the next year, I spent just doing research, because this is a gigantic topic, and it affects every single one of us. And it is an amplification and an example of the mystical truth that all is one. So as Ted and I talked, one of the things that became really apparent to us was that not only was all this terrible stuff happening, but we said, how in the world did we get to this place where we became so blind to what we were doing to the Earth, to what was happening, to what we're surrounded by, to what we're breathing and eating and drinking and living in? How did we get so blind to this? And the only conclusion we could come to was that we had a shattered first chakra, that we had lost our connection to the Earth, that there is no other way to understand what's going on this planet without looking at it through that lens. So I was really interested today when Carolyn started the thing about the 60s through the present time. And it's a perfect overlay to describe some of what I talk about in the book. I'd like to go back to 1945 when Carolyn was talking about the dawn of a new light, basically when we split the atom for the first time. There were always parallel things going on, and we discovered this big time as we were going through the research on the book. And so just think about what was happening after World War II. After we split the atom and won the war, there was a lot of prosperity happening. Of course, everything was great. And there was this little known substance back then called DDT. Oh, okay. A little known substance called DDT, which is one molecule off of nerve gas. There was tons of it left over. We never used it for that, but what the Army discovered, our armed forces discovered, was that DDT was a really effective pesticide. and it was able to kill lice. And a lot of our soldiers, anybody watching the Pacific knows that our soldiers would live sometimes for months in the same clothes. And they would contract lice, and from lice you get typhus. So typhus killed more people in World War I than bullets. So this was like this was a boon to the survival rates of our soldiers. Became a really, wonderful thing. Well, so right after that, we had the boom times. And so farmers were being told by chemical companies, not only does this stuff take out lice, it'll kill the pests. It'll kill the pests that are in your, in your lands. So here we are feeding the world because it's after the war. We've decimated a lot of Europe. A lot of Southeast Asia's wiped out. We need to grow a lot of crops. So this helped maximize yields. But it also did something else. It co-opted nature, and it overrode the process of photosynthesis, which is Mother Nature's way of dictating how fast and what grows. So segue again now into the 60s. And here we are with the peace and love and all that stuff we talked about today. And in addition to these things, there were two really important things that happened in the 60s. One was a little book by a woman named Rachel Carson. And it was called Silent Spring. And the purpose of this book was to explain to the planet that all that DDT we'd been using for 15 years at that point was causing some pretty serious problems. And it was only going to get worse. Silent Spring refers to the fact that there was no bird song in much of America because birds were dying from the effects of DDT. And what she was pointing to is that if it's killing birds, it's also getting into our cycles. It's getting into our water, into our soil, into our air. We're not escaping this. So anyway, we had all the great stuff that was going on then. These were all individual rights that were being talked about here for the first time. We had everything we talked about: civil rights, gay rights, women's rights, ending the war, blah, blah, blah. Earth Day was sort of the capstone of the 60s. And it said, for the first time, let's recognize species rights. Let's recognize planetary rights. So this was the first formal recognition that we can't keep doing this endlessly. Okay, so we go into the 70s. And the 70s were really the time when agriculture went wild. We were so successful. We were doing great things. We were, from the 60s on until 74, we were the Saudi Arabia of the world. For every 6 barrels we were producing, we were only using 1. 1 out of every 3 barrels of oil in the world came from the United States of America. By 1974, we were importing 35% of our oil. And we had already reached what's known as peak oil in this country. So this was a big, big bummer for us because all of a sudden it meant, because of OPEC, that we had lost control of 97% of our inputs coming from foreign countries. So we revved up agriculture because Russia started getting in on the scene. And all of a sudden we started hearing something called hedgerow to hedgerow growing. And what that meant was we began to get rid of our wildness. That we were growing for the sake of growth, for the sake of profit. And everything else, Katie, bar the door. Well, some very interesting things happened in the 80s, which is the age of narcissism, as Carolyn said. This was the decade that we deregulated, where we said, hell no, we're not going to cut down on the amount of oil we're using. We're going to bring in even more. We were using 32 barrels per person per year in the 70s. By this time, we had, through conservation efforts, we'd gotten it down, and it's somewhere around 26 barrels per person per year, which is where we are right now. So we hit deregulation, and the agricultural boom which had happened in the 70s began to peak and drop off. We glutted the world with grain. So what happened was that our farmers started to die. And you heard that right. It was the farmers in addition to the farms. In the 30s, 33% of our population was farmers. Today it's 1%. And a lot of that stems from this time because all actions have consequences. Because farmers were no longer able to pay off the debt that they had incurred in this boom time, they began to go bankrupt to the tune of 35,000 farmers a year at the worst part of this the worst part of this decade. And during that decade, the leading cause of death with farmers was suicide. Because what happens with the farmer is that his heart's broken. Because the farmer is the steward of the earth. That's what they live for. So as we began to lose these stewards, and they faded from the scene, what we began to get in the 90s was the growth of commercial agriculture. And that's where we are right now. That has continued all the way through here. Now, there was another little thing that happened here that was realized in the 90s that has a direct impact on every single person in this room. And I write about it extensively in an entire chapter that deals with seeds and soil. And this was the dawning. It's so interesting that you called this the decade of evolution, because this is the greatest sacrilege to evolution that ever happened. This is the genetically modified organisms that are now the basis of our diet. And I know it sounds great if you eat soy, but 95% of the soy made in the United States is GMO'd. And somebody asked Monsanto back here in the 80s, in the 80s and 90s, what's your dream? What do you want to do by the beginning of the 21st century? And they said, we want to own the royalty rights to every seed grown on the planet. And every one of those seeds will be genetically modified. Now, the reason they wanted that was not just because they wanted to, just change seed and own it. They wanted the rights to those seeds because you are not allowed to share seeds, which has been the basis of farming forever, for the 12,000 years that we've had agriculture. You not only can't share seed, you have to pay Monsanto every year. You have to pay them a royalty because they own the intellectual rights to that seed. So here we are in the age of GMOs. This is also where the internet began to become much more prevalent. It was here it began as the personal computer. And of course it hit our egos, personal, oh boy, I can have a computer. Over here it began to be much more pervasive. We began to understand and be comfortable with the invisible world. And this is also on the light side. This is when our connections began, all those invisible connections that we all love in our little handheld sets these days. So here we are losing this heart connection with our farmers. And here we are in basically the 2000s to the 10s, when more good stuff is happening because it's coming into consciousness. We're beginning to wake up to this. But what we have seen happen in the last 60 years has been way out of proportion to what's ever happened in history before. So what we're entering into is what Carolyn calls it's not just a chronos linear timeline that we need to think about. We're actually moving into the possibility of a holographic change. That's what's going to, if anything is going to save the Earth, it's got to be something that's besides a linear time, other than a linear timeline.